The premise of blood being thicker than water means for many of us that our concept of family is our strongest, most unbreakable bond that defines our belonging. It is not uncommon, however, for families to fight, for loved ones and siblings to argue, become frustrated, and even lash out. It is true that bonds so strong also create equally strong emotions. It is also true that while the cold, hard morning light breathes new life and possibility into the day, it also lifts the darkness, uncovering the secretive activities hidden within the previous evening. And while many of us face personal tragedy and endure hardships that are seldom known to more than our closest and most trusted supportive inner circles, this is not always the case. Indeed, in a world where all things were equal, we would all be offered the same anonymity to absorb, process, and grieve our most personal tragedies. There would be no such opportunity for the Walsh family, as a father is killed, a son accused, and a family torn apart while public tributes mean to simply grieve in private was just not possible. When public reaction overwhelms, it is easy to be caught up in the emotion of the story, and there was no shortage of either as we continue to cover the death of Phil Walsh here on the next episode of Just Lawful.
Adelaide is the perfect place to set a horror story. You know why all those films and books are always set in sleepy conservative towns? Because sleepy conservative towns are where those things happen. Exorcism, omens, shining, poltergeists. Adelaide is Amityville, or Salem, and things here go bump in the night.
Indeed, they do go bump in the night. Welcome again to Just Lawful. My name is Daniel Pinozzo, and I am once again joined by my co-host, Sean Fuster.
Thanks, Daniel, and thanks to everyone out there for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us. And before we begin, a huge thank you to all of you who have listened through our past episodes, whether you've caught that on the broadcast with 5AA or through our podcast, which is available either at iTunes or Spotify. Please subscribe, leave us a 5-star rating, review, rate, all of those things. It helps us get our work out to the masses, and we very, very much appreciate that. And it's going to give you a bit of a background onto how we got to where we are in this series. For this episode, similar to those previous, if you find anything we discussed distressing, or you have someone who you feel may be in a vulnerable mental state, please make use of the following support resources if you're in South Australia. The South Australian Government Mental Health Triage Service on 131 465. They're a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week service that provides information on mental health emergency and crisis situations. Also, the Acute Crisis Intervention Support Line on 131 466. If you have someone in a vulnerable situation, they can call on your behalf and help get them through that time.
We can't overstate what an important resource that is, as our recent episodes have made clear, and as this story will continue to make clear.
On that point, Sean, as this story continues on, in our last episode, we were introduced to a story that I think a lot of us felt we knew and felt that we had the information we needed to make, I guess, an opinion or have an emotive response or reaction toward. I really hope that you and I started to break down some of that and maybe give, I guess, the information that would provide us, all of us, to have a different idea, lens, perspective, maybe start to change our paradigm on what we think we know about this.
And if we haven't yet, strap in, because we will.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say we will. I mean,
I've got no doubt that we will.
As we move into this, I just want to, before we move forward, let's just recap. So in our last episode, we started with a tragic incident. We started with the death of a man, which was witnessed by his wife and which was then perpetrated by his son.
That's right.
We then went through and wanted to give, I guess, some personality to that. And by way of doing that, we introduced who Phil Walsh, the person, was, gave a little bit of his background, and certainly spoke about his achievements, accomplishments, his accolades, all of that in his professional career, and then started to transition that into what that looked like in his personal career as a family man, etc.
Because, of course, Phil was one of the greats of Australian rules football, the AFL. Certainly
was. And as I said, huge amounts of accomplishments and achievements. And more than that, I wanted to really highlight, I guess, the breadth of his exposure to the game, in the sense that it wasn't just one team in one city, and it wasn't just as a player. He was a support coach, became a head coach. He had played in 3 different cities. He had coached and been involved in the game across 4 states in this country. So a really wide breadth of exposure in that sense, and certainly did mean a lot to the AFL community. We then did something a little bit different, and we went back and we recapped and we retold you that same incident with the names involved of the people you now know within that story. I personally felt they gave it an extra level of gravity, being able to then retrofit those names to the situation.
And it's interesting because it kind of mirrors the journalistic exercise you have to go through. We've talked before on this show of there's no such thing as an unbiased journalist. There are only journalists who remove their bias enough to report the story. In a way, that's kind of the exercise you undertake. You've got to remove those external considerations, that broader context, in order to tell the story accurately, especially when it's a court case story, where there might be questions of juries coming up, questions of evidence, admissibility, things like that.
I'd really like if our listeners could go back, and I just want them to really think about that last episode. And when we went through and you gave us the objective elements of an incident at the start, and very black and white and very, I don't want to use the word bland, but very just vanilla in that sense.
Matter of fact.
How did you feel about that situation? What emotion did that drive in you of this tragic circumstance? And then when we retold that at the end and you knew who the people were and you had some context around that, did you feel the same? Did you feel differently about that? And if so, how so and why? Because I think that really highlights and I guess underpins what this case meant to this state, if you like. These certain tragic situations happen regularly, and I hate using the term regularly, but it is a regular occurrence, unfortunately, that in our community this occurs. A lot of the time we don't have the spotlight on it and the exposure to it because that, I guess, that level of what you want to call celebrity is not attached to it. When you add that to it, it can quite often feel very different.
To me, this is an example where context almost overwhelmed the incident. Because once you put the name Walsh into this, once you put that football connection into this, for better or for worse, it ceases to be just, quote unquote, an incident of familial violence and becomes a national tragedy, a national issue, an absolute spotlight grabbing incident.
Yeah, I certainly felt that way. And even I knew the way that we had constructed that in that last episode, it still felt like there was an extra layer of familiarity once the names were attached. And I don't know the Walsh family personally. I know of his contribution to the AFL and therefore, that wider spotlight it got. So there was certainly for me a different feel for that.
And interestingly for me, there wasn't. Because as we talked about, I'm not the biggest football fan. I have the familial connection, but not the personal connection. So to me, at the time, and even now, I tend to think of Phil Walsh within the context of fatherhood and familial relationships before I think of him being a celebrity, a football person.
Yeah, and I guess I kind of remember, and we're going to touch on this a little bit later, I kind of remember some of the outpouring and the tributes that occurred at that time when the incident happened, which I really distinctly remember those tributes and the outpouring of that emotion through that as well. To get us there, let's, I guess, attempt to pick up where we left off. And we started with the incident, gave you some retrofitted idea of personality, went back to the incident. Now, we know at that time, Sy had essentially handed himself into police. Let's pick up from, I guess, there. What happened at that point?
So this is me reconstructing a little bit because as we've talked about, you only hear about in court what you need to hear about for the sake of the case. Sy was arrested. He was charged. We heard on our last episode what he said. He didn't believe his father had died. When he found out he had, he said he was hearing voices. We talked, unfortunately, about the fact that Sy injured himself in police custody through no fault of the officers and had to be sedated for his own good.
Yeah.
The story started getting out, my understanding, around the 5 a.m., 6 a.m. mark.
Because the incident itself was around about sort of 2 a.m.-ish, thereabouts. So
That's
2
right.
a.m. in the morning. It's about 5 o'clock now. The word is starting to permeate out.
And as it permeates through the football community, of course, there's that symbiotic relationship between the AFL and the media. It starts to percolate through the media. You've got breakfast radio starting to come on talking about these sorts of things.
So what time did you first hear about it?
So I would have woken up about 7 that morning, and I would have heard about it within minutes of waking up. One of the very first things I do is I tend to go to the computer, switch it on, have breakfast in front of the computer, catch up on the news from overnight.
Okay.
So upon discovering, I don't remember whether I heard it on radio, whether I saw it on the internet first, I turned to my wife and said, don't wait up. This is going to be a very long day.
Yeah.
Because I had a mental picture of what my piece of this was going to be. Obviously, you're going to have obituary writers in the newsroom doing their bit. You're going to have football writers examining the football side of things. You're going to have police reporters out at the scene, talking to neighbours, talking to eyewitnesses. I'm sure at that point that the police were going to call some kind of press conference. The AFL would likely call a press conference. This was going to be all points bulletin. Again, I'm going to make the comparison like a political assassination response.
It really was.
My part in all of this was going to be to sit out the front of courtroom 2 of the Adelaide Magistrates Court for as long as it took for Cy Walsh's case to be called on. Because once you're arrested, you make your first appearance in the Magistrates Court. Doesn't matter what you're charged with. If you are denied police bail, and let's face it, there was no way Cy Walsh was going to get police bail for these allegations, you are then remanded in custody to face the Magistrates Court at the very next hearing, where you can apply for bail, and if not, you're remanded into further custody. Sometime between 10:30 and 5 p.m, Cy Walsh was going to appear in the Adelaide Magistrates Court.
Okay.
There's no timetable on that.
Right.
So the job of the court reporter is to, as I said, you sit in the lobby out the front of courtroom 2 for as long as it takes.
Right.
That was my lot in life.
So let's just understand. So 2 o'clock the incident occurs. About 5 o'clock the word starts to permeate. You understand that about 7 o'clock, at which point you say, don't wait up, it's going to be a late night. And then you just wait.
Well, actually, I pretty much get ready and go to the office because there's things I can do.
Right.
And that's background material, research time. As I've admitted, I'm not the biggest football person. I need to understand who Phil Walsh is.
Well, to that point, Phil Walsh, I think, is well known. Perhaps who wasn't so well known was his son, Cy.
Daniel, I want to read you a quote. "We coexist in a society where violence is an accepted part of daily life. It comes back to our individual responsibilities as fully developed adults to set good examples for our children. We need to cultivate a culture of nurturing, safety, and love, not one of violence, bullying, and fear." Really nice sentiment, right?
Indeed.
Those are the words of Cy Walsh from one of his personal blogs.
Okay.
I said to you a moment ago that I needed to do some research. I needed to acquaint myself with who Phil Walsh was. That's one of those things that you don't want to admit to an editor of a major metropolitan newspaper.
Certainly not one in this town, which is, let's face it, sport mad.
That's right. Sorry, boss. I don't actually know anything about our football coach, so just give me 20 minutes to catch up. You don't say that. You don't say that. You just, okay, I don't know this. I'm going to quietly do that research. Because the job at the time, as you say, was to find out all I could about Cy Walsh. I had a lot of help with this. I had some great colleagues in the newsroom, both in the general news department and the sports department, who were doing an awful lot of data plumbing for me, shooting links my way, social media posts, Facebook links, things like that. And we started between us all to actually pull together a profile of who Cy was.
Right.
Because to this point, I think there was maybe 1 or 2 mentions of Cy in the paper's archives by name. One of them, of course, being that interview that Phil Walsh had done where he said, "I want to reconnect with my son.
Sure.
I feel like I've allowed my duties as a father to fall a little by the wayside and be subsumed by football." That was about it in terms of mentions of Cy. He lived his life online, and that's where we started finding out things about him. One of the best sources in those early hours was a place called couchsurfing.com. It's a social media network of, according to itself, 10 million interesting locals in over 230 countries and territories all across the world. It's like Airbnb, but for backpackers.
Okay.
If you don't want to stay in a backpacking hostel and think about the potential issues that might come from that,
Sure.
but you don't have the money for an Airbnb, you join this couchsurfing.com, you look for other people that are offering up a couch to sleep on for a night, 2 nights, 3 nights, and you can use that. You've, of course, got to offer your own couch in your own home, in your own country in exchange.
Sure.
And Cy was a member. He'd said on his entry, "My parents and me share the space. The spare bedroom is ready to go with inflatable mattress. Smoking is fine. Pet dog in residence, Jack Russell. Near oval for Aussie rules games. We sleep early and wake early. 3 nights max." Think about what we know about the Walsh family from Phil's own descriptions. That's exactly right. Live near a football oval, go to bed early, get up early. 3 nights max. I remember reading that and thinking, did Phil know that Cy had offered their house out?
Yeah, that's interesting. I was thinking the exact same thing. I wonder how much that was known.
Because you've got to, and I want you to do this, and I want our listeners to do this as well. Put yourself in the mindset of Sean on Friday, July 3, 2015. In my mind right now, this is a murder.
Yeah.
I have no reason to think otherwise.
Yeah.
All I have information-wise, famous football coach stabbed, killed, son arrested.
Mm-hmm.
Son was, I think I knew at that point, walking the streets and was arrested.
Okay.
I think I knew that much. That's not a lot to go on.
That's very limited.
So instantly go, okay, this is probably a murder.
Mm-hmm.
This might be some kind of family argument. So you see something like, come and stay at famous AFL football coach's house. Did he know? Was that the source of the argument? Has somebody turned up on their doorstep from Brazil or out of Mongolia and the two of them have had an argument about this? You just don't know.
Sure.
So then I looked at how Cy described himself to people. He said he was a cocktail bartender originally from Geelong with a diploma in Japanese, that he'd lived in Australia and Japan and had visited Cambodia, India, Indonesia, Japan, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, and the Amazon jungle.
Okay.
Interesting combination there, especially that last one. Southeast Asia and the Amazon jungle. But of course, think about the Peru incident with the truck.
Absolutely.
Maybe that's what he's talking
Sure.
about, I'm thinking. He described his current mission as prepare myself financially, spiritually, and linguistically for the adventure of my life.
Okay.
Typical young man trying to find his way stuff.
Mm-hmm.
He'd last logged into this about 2 months before the incident. He said, "My number one priority is to live and experience each moment, no matter what, to a degree of success."
Okay.
All of this is very life-affirming and praiseworthy. Then, the deeper I read, the more I started to get a little bit concerned. He described himself as an aspiring pickup artist. Now, anybody out there that is not familiar with that term, pickup artistry is a, let's be polite, controversial way of dating and meeting women. A lot of it involves misogynistic behavior, putting women down, negging them, as they call it, to make them feel bad about themselves in order to be vulnerable to dating or anything else. I see pickup artist and I start to worry. The rest of the sentence goes, with a passion for Asia, Asian girls, and learning Japanese. When I'm not out studying Japanese, I'm with my friends, building my social circle, or out sarging Asian college girls in an attempt to expand that circle. Sarging is another term from within this pickup artist culture.
Okay.
And I mean, if you think of a drill sergeant,
Yeah.
pretty much gives you the idea of what we're talking about here.
Wondering that myself.
Cy says in his blog, "The things we believe are often false, and discovering that I'm completely inaccurate in my beliefs is fine with me. It's all part of the learning process of life to be corrected, to make mistakes, to fall off the horse. In this vein, I would like to establish that I may or may not actually have a clue about what I'm talking about. However, even if I am in reality wrong and think I'm correct, I will always talk as if I know what I'm on about and act as if my word is final. Why? Because it's part of being a confident person." Fake it till you make it.
Yeah. Okay. I get that. That sounds to me very.
Bravado?
Not even, Sean. I don't want to use the word confused because he seems very certain in what he's saying. However, the concepts are very contradictory to themselves at the same time.
There's a bit of struggle for a search for meaning in there, I think.
And also, and look, and I don't know in that sense, and I never met the person. It almost sounds like I'm giving myself an out if I happen to do the wrong thing. I've got an out that covers me for that also. And that's kind of that's my own take.
Well, the title of the blog was More Than a Man. Words may show a man's wit, but actions his meaning.
Okay.
Deep thought, but
Sure.
also, I'm going to be impolite here, a little bit of a cliche, a little bit trite, you know?
Yeah.
Sai was saying on these blogs that his current project was the Asian Girlfriend Project.
Okay.
His goal, I mean, we'd already heard that his goal was to live and experience each moment, but on another website, his goal was to land an Asian girlfriend.
Okay.
That was his purpose. He describes encounters with foreign girls, one of whom was using drugs, which he said made that end game for me. Now, that stuck out for me. Okay, so he's talked about being a pickup artist. That was a red flag for me. But he's saying drugs are a no-go.
Yeah.
Okay, we're starting to get a bit of a sense of at least the persona that Sai was putting across, who he was telling the world he was.
That's interesting. I almost took that as something different, Sean.
Really?
The end game being, if I could have my persona plus an Asian girlfriend, and if there were drugs involved, that's my end game to get there. That is...
You know, it's been 7 years and I've never thought of it that way.
And that is just, as you read that, for me, that's almost the case of my end game is to have my persona, my Asian girlfriend, and have a drug-related, a situation involved in that. That is the end game for me. And look, I could be completely wrong, and maybe I'm biased by what we know was to occur, and perhaps some of Sai's behaviour outside of that. That's how I read that.
That's fascinating. And look, this is an unscripted moment. 6 years, almost 7 years that this case has been a part of my life. I have never read that sentence as anything other than endgame, meaning, nah, off the table, I'm done, not interested.
Yeah, no, I think I take a different perspective and a different take on that.
Fascinating.
There you go.
I've never thought about it that way before. And now that you say it, well, it's interesting you say it. Let me tell you the next bit.
Maybe I'm wrong and I don't know yet.
Well, you might not be, because let me tell you this next bit. I thought this was a contradiction in
Sure.
terms, because by this point I'm used to contradictions.
Absolutely.
Sai describes an experience of getting, quote, blind drunk,
Okay.
unquote. And he says, I become very emotional, and I don't just mean I get all sad and want to cry and kill myself, although occasionally that might happen. What I mean is that I become a wild beast of emotion in general. Hate, love, sadness, whatever. I want to fight some guy who didn't even look at me. Next time, I try to grab some girl and yank her into the bathroom. I'll start picking up people and telling them that I like them, or pointing in faces and calling people bitches. It has, quite unfortunately, become a bit of a problem for me. That was the extent of Sai Walsh's social media presence.
Right.
And the picture that I'm left with at this point, I'm thinking that now it's maybe 9:30, coming close to 10 o'clock, maybe even 10:30 in the morning on that Friday. It's the time where I need to leave my office and go across
Sure.
and just camp out at the magistrate's court. The mental picture I've got of this kid right now is incredibly conflicted, and I'm a little concerned.
Yeah.
I'm still looking at this as an alleged murder. I have someone who's talking online about being drunk to the point of aggressiveness, someone who has copped to being part of a culture that could be considered misogynistic, someone who is talking about some very nice big picture thoughts on ending violence and setting a good example, someone who's been arrested for the murder of his father.
And has also stated in that, although he thinks there should be this humanitarian aspect in ending that violence, has himself said he's prone to becoming blind drunk and actually creating these fits of violence also.
And also not committing to any of his ideals because he might actually be wrong about them.
Absolutely. It seems very... I'm truly fascinated too. As you said, I don't really know how much of a picture you could have actually gotten from that in that short space about this, while you've got this looming situation of, I still now have to go to court to wait to find out, what is this all about? What is this situation that's gone on? Because as you said, all you know so far, there has been an alleged murder of a famous football coach, potentially by his son, who's been arrested.
Welcome back to Just Lawful, where I continue to grapple with the application of the word endgame. I'm still spinning out over that.
That's okay, Sean. There's plenty of terminology and concepts that you throw at me that I grapple with for very, very, very lengths of time. So that's 1-0 to me today, but I'm still playing catch up. Let's be honest.
So here in 2021, as we're recording,
Right.
I'm learning what endgame means.
Perfect.
Back in 2015,
Correct.
I'm now sitting out the front of the second courtroom 2 of the Adelaide Magistrates Court, waiting for Cy Walsh to appear.
Is there anything, I guess, going through your head or what's happening at this point? I mean, you said you're waiting and you don't necessarily know what's happening or how long this is going to take. I can only imagine there's a buzz from other media at the same time. It's not just yourself, clearly, that's waiting there. Is there a vibe? Is there a feeling? Is there something that's going on at that stage?
The biggest fear everyone had at that moment was their mobile phones going flat because the newsrooms were calling constantly.
Right.
Every couple of minutes. Have you heard anything yet? Has anything happened yet? Courtroom 2 is on the ground floor of the Magistrates Court.
Mm-hmm.
It's on the same level, therefore, as the court registry. So when charges are filed, they are walked over by a human being from the registry on one side of the building to courtroom 2 on the other. Every court orderly that goes past, your ears prick up. Is that the Walsh file? Is that the Walsh file? I can't tell you. You take turns running into court to see what's actually going on because you don't want to sit in there the whole time. You have to be quiet.
Yeah.
So we're sitting outside, we're talking, we're conversing, we're bemoaning the fact that the bosses are calling every 13 seconds. It was very, very late in the day.
Right.
Very late in the day that the Walsh matter came up.
Okay.
And it was over within seconds.
Right.
One of the
Okay.
sheriff's officers told us to come in, that the Walsh file was ready. We went in, we sat down. Prosecutor was present. Magistrate was present. No defence counsel.
Okay.
No Cy Walsh in the dock.
Mm.
No Cy Walsh on the video link.
Is that unusual at this stage?
I'd not seen this before.
Okay.
Well, tell a lie. I had seen it before, but not like this.
Right.
The only thing I'm thinking at that point is bedside hearing,
Sure.
which is where someone has been injured in the course of an alleged crime and have been charged, and they're going to appear from their bedside in hospital.
Mm.
But usually defence counsel's in the room.
Yeah, right.
The defendant is on the phone. You'll have that awkward moment where a court calls a hospital and has to get put through, and there's hold music, and it's a bit weird. It takes the gravitas out of everything quite oddly. I feel for families that are in those situations because it's just the last thing you want is some easy listening news act to come piping through a courtroom when you're in a moment of grief. It's terrible.
Yeah.
So with no defence counsel there, that was fairly unprecedented for me, if not completely unprecedented. Turned out that Cy Walsh's lawyer was actually at the hospital with him.
Okay.
And the reason she was there was because he was still sedated.
Of course. He injured himself earlier. We sedated him, but he's still under sedation.
This is my point. He was sedated in the early hours of the morning.
Exactly.
We're close to 5 p.m. He's still sedated at this point.
Okay.
And you've got to remember, at this point, 2015, Sean didn't know that Cy Walsh had been sedated in the early hours of the morning.
Right, okay.
There's no information about that yet. For all I knew, he was in the City Watch House. So I'm finding out in this moment, he's in hospital, he's in a hospital bed. Oh, wait a minute, does that mean perhaps is he injured as well? And he's sedated.
Okay.
Now, what does sedated mean? Does that mean, again, you don't know it's a mental health case at this point.
No, that's right.
So does he have injuries as well? You start to speculate. Was this a fight?
Yeah.
What has actually happened here? How many people have been injured in this incident? Because if you're thinking that this is a murder, you're not necessarily thinking someone needs to be sedated for their own mental needs. You're thinking they might need to be sedated to recover from an injury.
Yeah.
There are no clear answers at this point. So I am pulling together an article that is, here's everything we know about Cy Walsh from his social media platforms, which is incredibly contradictory. And here's a court appearance that's over in 15 seconds, remanded in custody for another 2 months, where we can't actually tell you anything other than he's sedated and he's in hospital.
So I think you just buried the lead a little bit there. So sorry, you said it was over in seconds. So you've waited all this time, and we're remanded in custody for a couple of months, you said?
2 months, yeah, which is fairly standard.
Yeah, I get that, but that's it.
That's it.
So, as you said, you're trying to cobble together this understanding, but within a few seconds, defence isn't even in the room, as you said. So defence is with the accused in the hospital, and within a matter of seconds, we're done and dusted and off we go.
The sinking feeling that you get as a journalist in that moment of, I can't actually stem the tide of speculation here. You just heard what I was speculating. Imagine now knowing that you've got this live hand grenade that you're about to roll into the community. The best you can do is pick up artist kid who is accused of killing his father, is sedated in hospital, more news to come in 2 months' time.
Yeah, right.
That's a horrible feeling.
Absolutely.
And you ring a boss and you say, this is what I can give you.
Yeah.
And the boss does the right thing and says, there's got to be more. No, there isn't, boss.
Yeah, right.
There isn't any more. Well, can you talk to anybody? Will the prosecutors talk? No, they won't talk. Well, what about his defense counsel? She's not even here. She's at the hospital. What do you mean hospital? And it all just unfurls from there.
Yeah, right. It's crazy. As you said, in a matter of seconds, you're trying to piece all that together with very limited information and still no further understanding of who Sy was either, mind you.
And let's cast forward a little bit and then come back. We talk about some of the entrenched attitudes that people have toward this case. Those early moments didn't help that.
No.
Because this is fertile ground for speculation, for misunderstanding, and for judgment. And I'm not dumping on anybody for that.
No.
When there is a lack of information, people make up their mind about things. And especially on that first rush of emotion, that first blush of understanding.
Yeah.
And that's where we were by the end of that day. We literally knew no more by the end of that day than we knew at the start of it.
Yeah, that is amazing and crazy, as you said, from that idea of having a very limited understanding just from a social media presence of who this person may or may not have been Sy and trying to cobble that together, going across, waiting all of this extended piece of time, having no context until you get in there, only have a few seconds to piece together the context that's delivered of no defence, no accused, bedside, and we're coming back in 2 months, remanded in custody in 2 months' time because he's sedated, and hang on, what just happened? That's crazy. That to me it feels so small in context to the actual situation so far. I want to shift gears a little bit because after that, and that was a Friday, Friday the 3rd of July. What we would see off the back of that, and I think this is probably where I'll take the lead a little bit because this is probably a bit more my area than yours, Sean, in the sense that I guess the tributes that would come out were, let's be honest, there was no shortage of them from across current players to former teammates, former players, former staff, and the AFL association and community at large. And I just want to give a little bit of context to the spotlight I talked about earlier that was given to this situation. And I'm going to start by that very night. So we know that throughout that day, so much had happened. And there were tributes that come out, but I want to talk about how big that was. And I'll touch on a few individual tributes in a moment, but that same night, there was a Friday night game to be played in Melbourne. So not even in South Australia where the incident happened, but in Melbourne. And it was one of Phil's, funnily enough, his former club's Collingwood, which for those out there, I'm going to out myself now. I am a long-time Collingwood fan. You can hate me more than you used to if you like. That's okay. I can wear that. We do that as Collingwood fans. But Collingwood and Hawthorn were playing that Friday night, and that's traditionally the first game of the round each weekend. There's a Friday night game, then Saturdays and Sundays, etc. The start of that game, both teams lined up facing each other, arm in arm, and had a memorial minute silence to remember Phil.
Wow.
That's not, as touching as that is, they played the game. Now, at the end of that game, both teams and coaches walked to the centre of the ground, and they were not separated by team. They were mixed together. It didn't matter. The two teams with coaching staff, arm in arm, around the centre circle, and they stood there in memorial for Phil Walsh. That is something that is unprecedented, unheard of, and it was. I remember watching that game. Obviously, that was my team playing, and just to see it at the end, that's when it became really real for someone like myself who was a fan watching.
We're not even 24 hours out from the incident.
We're not 24 hours. We're maybe 18 hours out, so not even a whole day out, right? The really touching piece around that was every game that weekend would replicate that same situation. They would have the minute silence, and after each game, both teams would walk to the centre. They would hold arm in arm to remember Phil Walsh as part of that. And it didn't matter if it was your club was part of Phil Walsh, part of your club or not. It didn't matter. It was that memorial situation.
Or every game bar one, because of course one game didn't go ahead.
Correct.
That much I know.
And you're right. And that was the Sunday, because on that Sunday, Adelaide was supposed to play at home against Geelong, which funnily enough is the town that Phil and Si was actually born in, Geelong. So, you know, there was a connection there as well.
Yeah,
Adelaide
couldn't
and Geelong.
be worse timing, could it really?
It was, no, in that sense, no, it couldn't. And yet in some ways it was touching and fitting, as odd as that sounds. I'm going to give you some context around that. They didn't play that game. Both teams forfeited, for want of a better term, and they split the premiership points for that game. But something really special did happen. Here in Adelaide, through supporters of the Adelaide Crows, they created a march to remember him, and they called it the March of Silence. And they started at our Parliament House, and they walked from Parliament House across the bridge over to Adelaide Oval, and they all poured into the Oval. And on Sunday afternoon at 2:50, which is the traditional start time of the game, they blew the siren just as they would if the game was going ahead. Now, here's another part of that. It wasn't just Adelaide Crows and, by extension, Port Power fans, as he had been both of those. Anyone who was a fan was encouraged to come along and wear their own team Guernsey. It was United colours. It didn't matter where you were from, just that you were part of that to remember Phil as part of the AFL community. So
it was about football, not about tribalism.
It was 15,000 people in attendance just to show support for that situation. So there was truly some amazing memorial moments given from the community as well as the AFL Association. I say all that to say that is how high priority and how much spotlight an incident like this gets depending on who the person is, which, whether we like it or not, makes it incredibly hard to separate the performance and the personality, the situation, the circumstance, and our emotion driven by what that may have meant to us as a community. Those were obviously some of the tributes given out by the community and the AFL Association, I said, and they were some very moving, wonderful tributes to this man. Some more intimate ones, I guess, would come from those who knew him personally, and a lot of those were, as I said, players or people within the association that he had, you know, dealings with. And I'm going to read a few of those out. I said I would, and I just want to give you some idea of some of the feeling and emotion around that and how people felt about the man. So AFL Chief Executive Gillan McLachlan said, our industry is grieving today. Phil Walsh was a man of boundless energy and enthusiasm, and his death is a tragic loss. The Adelaide chairman, Rob Chapman, said, this is a crisis unprecedented. There is no rule book, and we're dealing with it. The Adelaide midfielder Patrick Dangerfield, he just simply said, look, Phil led and we followed. His standards and philosophies will forever guide all those who knew him. I feel blessed to have known Phil Walsh, and I am a better person because of him.
Not just a better player, a better person.
Correct. And that was a signature. As you said early on, he had a real ability to connect with young men in that sense. And the Crows captain at the time, Taylor Walker, even said, look, obviously we're pretty lucky to be in a footy club. It's an environment where we stick together and we can lean on each other. When we heard the news, everyone took it their own way. But it's a pretty numb feeling at the moment. A couple others, Kane Corns, who was actually from the Port Power team, not the Crows team, and he was retired at that point. He just said, rest easy, great man. Thank you for everything you did for me and my family. Love you, mate. So that is that real connection I talked about. I want to read one more last one out here, and that was Major Crime Superintendent Des Bray said, it's not even just that he's a high-profile person. It's just absolutely terrible when families are torn apart in such tragic circumstances. For any family, regardless of who it is, this is one of the worst things you could imagine that could happen to you.
And Des Bray knows worse things because
Yeah.
Des Bray has been the head of major crime, which is, for want of a better term, homicide branch in South Australia Police for a very long time. He knows what he's talking about when he talks about the worst thing that people can possibly face.
Absolutely. And I just like the fact that that puts that perspective back on it, that yes, this is horrible and tragic. It is horrible and tragic, regardless of who you are and what your personality and profile is. So I just want to put that context to that as well. That was some of the initial outcry and the memorial and just the memories and thoughts of Phil. And they would continue for weeks and months on and on. But the context I want to move from here is we know how the community was feeling at this stage. You as a journalist, and I guess we as a community then had to wait 2 months, as you said, until we could find out what is the next step.
I knew that court was coming up again on September 15th, 2015. So on September 13th, I put an application in with the court.
Okay.
Now, we've talked before on previous episodes about how you can apply for documents from court, and you can get them or you can not get them. A judge or a magistrate has unfettered discretion as to whether or not they're released.
Right.
There's a set of documents that are filed in the early days of a court case under the umbrella term of declarations, witness statements, forensic reports, ballistics reports, maps of areas, basically anything and everything that the defence is going to need to determine whether their client should plead guilty or not guilty to a criminal case.
Right.
At that point in journalism, there was a bit of controversy over whether or not we should be trying to get a hold of declarations.
Okay.
Is it a step too far to ask for these pieces of paper, or is it just good journalistic ethics to be trying to get all the information you can as soon as you can?
Sure.
Now, the Times' editor at the time was a man called Sam Weir, former court reporter, had done the job before I did. Sam was very much of the opinion that you apply for everything and you worry about it later.
Yep. Okay. Makes sense.
Big believer in don't ask, don't get.
Correct.
So the word came down from on high, Sean, if Walsh is going to be back in court on September 15, try to get those declarations. Okay. So I applied for them. Didn't hear anything back prior to court. So we go to court on September 15th, and the game changes again. This time, Cy Walsh is there, not in person, but by video link. The minute the video link turns on, I notice something. That's not a cell in the background of that shot.
Sure.
That's not the video room that exists at the Adelaide Remand Centre or Yatala Labour Prison, Mobilong, any of the other major correctional facilities. I know those curtains and I know those blue chairs. That's James Nash House.
Right.
That's the secure mental health facility.
Yeah.
Cy Walsh is being held in a mental health facility. So all my speculation from 2 months earlier starts to go in a completely different direction now.
Yeah.
If they're holding him at James Nash House, that means we're in Section 269 territory.
Yep.
He must be being assessed. He's dressed in a bottle green tracksuit, though, and a bottle green tracksuit belongs to a remand prisoner. Persons who appear from James Nash House are usually wearing their own clothing.
Okay.
So there's a mixed message here visually.
Definitely.
Very mixed message. Not everyone would pick up on, but that's one of those old-timey court reporter
Experience
things.
stuff, yeah.
The prosecutor, Lucy Board, says we need to have a further 7 weeks.
Okay.
There's some toxicology still outstanding that's going to take, I'm advised, about 6 weeks, she told the court. The toxicology that's been done is on a hair sample. We're also awaiting a large amount of e-crime evidence that needs to be extracted and put in a form that's suitable for the court. Magistrate Elizabeth Shepherd was a little puzzled by this, and so she asked, is the hair sample being tested for DNA? And Ms. Board said, no, it's not. Ms. Shepherd said, will you tell me what it's being tested for? And Ms. Board said, no.
Okay.
All I will say is that it's being tested for toxicology.
Right.
There's 2 ways of looking at that. Toxicology is, of course, testing the bloodstream for drugs. Drugs remain in your hair follicles long
Much
after
longer.
they've passed your system.
Correct.
So my question to myself at that point is, are they testing Cy to find out whether or not he's on any form of mental health medication? Or are they testing Cy to find out whether he should have been on mental health medication but it wasn't in his system when they thought it should be? Or are they testing him for some kind of drug that might have had a psychotropic effect?
That's where I immediately was thinking.
Because remember, it's not a mental health impairment case if you have a drug-induced psychosis.
Correct.
If you've taken something that has done you wrong and turned you into this,
Yes.
you are not afforded the same legal rights as someone who has a naturally occurring mental illness.
Yeah.
Which is a very weird phrase to say, naturally occurring mental illness. So I'm speculating at this point myself. At that point, lawyers for Walsh say that they've explained to their client what's going on. They ask the court whether they can make a formal order that their client be remanded to James Nash House.
Mm.
And Miss Shepherd says, well, he's at James Nash House. Well, yes, Your Honour, we prefer that he remain at James Nash House, but we don't have any medical evidence to provide to the court at this stage to secure his place there.
Mm.
Again, that's not where Section 269 matters normally go.
No.
So you've got someone at James Nash House who apparently isn't there under a mental health detention order by the sounds of things, and is wearing prison greens.
Yep.
Lots of mixed messages going on.
Yep.
Prosecution says they won't stand in the way of this,
Mm.
but it's not for them to determine where someone is or is not housed. That should be left to the Department for Correctional Services. Right. In the end, the magistrate says, look, I agree. I can't actually order that he stay at James Nash House. I will just remand him in custody. And so the matter's put off for a further 7 weeks.
Right.
Very, very odd.
Still no real understanding, or certainly not closing any of the loose ends, tying any loose ends up here to give you any real understanding, is it?
Fraying more.
Yeah, exactly.
Fraying more loose endings. Later that day, though, this was an early morning hearing. Later that day, I get a phone call.
Mm.
And it's from the Magistrates Court Registry.
Okay.
They say, look, you've been granted permission to have the declarations in the Cy Walsh matter.
Okay.
Can you come get them, please? Fantastic. I walk back to the courthouse. I told you the registry is on the same floor as courtroom 2. So I go into the registry. Hi, I'm Sean Fuster from The Advertiser. You gave me a call. You told me the declarations were ready for the Walsh matter. Oh, yes, wait here, please.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine like a bank teller type situation. Yep. That's what the registry's like.
Yeah.
Glass walls, only a tiny bit underneath. So I sit down and I wait. I'm waiting 5 minutes or so. And the counter staff comes back with one of those cardboard boxes that you get printer paper in.
Mm.
You know, those big, thick boxes.
That have like 6, 7, 8, whatever packets
reams
of them.
paper.
Yeah, reams, yeah.
Puts it down in front of me.
Okay.
Walks away. Comes back with a second one.
Right.
And a third.
Mm-hmm.
And keeps going. This bucket brigade continues until there are 7 photocopying paper boxes in front of me.
You're right.
And I look at this person, I say, what's this? And they're like, oh, these are the Walsh declarations. I'm sorry, this has got to be like 700 pages here. They're like, yeah, that's right. So this is mine to look at. Yeah, that's right. If you need anything copied, let us know. Otherwise, you can take notes. Okay, says I. I'm in completely deep waters here. I've never had anything like this happen to me in all my years of court reporting. Not before, and certainly not since.
Okay.
So I pick up the first document, and it's a psychological report. Right. I pick up the second document, and it's Meredith Walsh's witness statement. I pick up the third document, and it's a witness statement from Kane Corns.
Okay.
The football player you just talked about.
Yeah.
And I start going through, and there are the deepest levels of intimate information from all sorts of people connected to this case. And I realize that they have just handed me every single piece of evidence they have against Cy Walsh to date.
And with that, and what would be contained within that documentation, we will pick back up in the next episode as we continue the case of the death of Phil Walsh. Until we get there, of course, we always want to remind you that there are available resources for yourself or anyone else you know who may be in a vulnerable situation. Please make use of the following resources if you're local. That's the South Australian Government Mental Health Triage Service on 131 465, or the Acute Crisis Intervention Support Line on 131 466. If you are interstate or international, please find and seek and use the resources in your local area. Until we get to our next episode, we of course want to thank everyone who has listened to us on the broadcast here at 5AA, or if you've listened to us on our podcast at iTunes and Spotify, please, as always, go there, rate, review, subscribe, do all those wonderful things that help get our message out to those who could hear and really make use of listening to us. If you want to get in contact with us, please, we love your feedback. We really, really rate it, especially in this series. And you can get a hold of us at Just Lawful Podcast on Facebook and Instagram, at Just Lawful Pod on Twitter. You can always follow Sean and his work with The Advertiser and Adelaide's True Crime at Sean Fuster on both Facebook and Twitter. And until we pick this up on our next episode and we uncover what was actually in that documentation that would make Sean's head spin around and give him an unparalleled understanding of what this case was really all about. We just want to remind you, enjoy our work, but don't become our work. And we'll speak to you on the next episode of Just Lawful.